Hello and welcome to today's SEI webcast, Evaluating Trustworthiness of AI Systems. My name is Shane McGraw, Outreach Team Lead here at the Software Engineering Institute, and I'd like to thank you for attending. We want to make today's webcast as interactive as possible, so we will address questions throughout today's discussion, and you can put those questions into the YouTube chat area now, and we will get to as many as we can. Our featured speakers today are Carol Smith, Gardner, and Katherine-Marie Robinson. Carol Smith joined the SEI in 2019 and leads research in the AI division to define AI engineering practices for human-centered and responsible AI and ML system development. Carol, great to have you here today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Gardner is a technical manager, also in our AI for Mission Center in our AI division. She's an accomplished technologist and strategist with extensive experience in advising government and business leaders on leveraging digital technologies to drive value and mitigate risk. Carrie, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shane. It's good to be with you.
And last but not least, Katherine-Marie Robinson is an assistant design researcher, also in our AI division. She completed her Bachelor of Science degrees in Biomedical Mechanical Engineering and Computing Technology from the University of Ottawa in Canada in 2020. Welcome, Katherine.
Hi, Shane. Really looking forward to the discussion today.
Great. Looking forward to it as well. Now I'd like to turn it over to Carol Smith. Carol, all yours.
Wonderful. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us. We look forward to answering your questions. We thought we'd start off by talking a little bit about our personal interests and hopes for today for discussion. I come from a background in human-computer interaction and user experience, and so I look forward to talking about how we can take those practices and combine them with technical ethics and other practices of responsible AI to help make better AI systems. Carrie?
Great. Thanks, Carol. So my interests really center on partnering with our technical sponsors and translating the state of the possible with AI into the state of practice. So investigating new techniques, practices, tooling, and workflows for cultivating AI solutions that really realize the intended return on investment. And I take that technologist perspective with experience in software engineering, machine learning engineering, as well as management science to really be able to measure and then create impactful AI solutions.
And Katie?
So my interests lie, when I was doing my master's, I did it into the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. And a lot of the themes that that were in there were about trust and trustworthiness. So having the opportunity to explore that and to hear other people's questions, especially where we are with AI and the future of AI, I think is really exciting. And I'm really looking forward to talking and answering some questions today as well.
Yeah. So we thought we'd start off just giving everyone our baseline of what we're talking about today, what trustworthiness is. And we talked about this in a recent blog. And it's really dependent on the end user's confidence in the system's ability to augment their needs. So how much information they have, how much evidence they have to get that confidence to really understand how that system works. And trustworthy systems are designed with an understanding of the context of use and careful attention to the end user's needs. And I'd like for each of you to add on to that. The trust and trustworthiness are complex topics.
Sure. To me, so when I think about trust and trustworthiness, I'm thinking about the dynamic state of how a user is actually interacting with the system changes over time. But it's also the perception of the credibility, the reliability, and the overall trust, if you will, of the human and their ability to rely upon the output of these AI-enabled systems. So it's dynamic, it changes, and then it's complex, right? And so through our blog, we did explore multiple different components of trust, validity, reliability, safety, security, and many others. And so it's complex and dynamic, to say the least.
Yeah, and I think to add on to Carrie's point there as well, trust is complex and trustworthiness is complex. And often when we see them in literature, they can be used interchangeably, which raises some confusion as well. But trustworthiness, and the way we've looked at it, is it's composed of all these different elements. So what's even more complex with that as well, you look at all these different elements and maybe you account for each one of them, but that may not even solve the whole problem of trustworthiness. You could account for each one of these aspects and people still might not trust the system or find the system trustworthy. So, you can take account for all of these different things, but there's still just the idea of trustworthiness goes maybe a little bit beyond that in terms of people's individual perceptions of what that actually means to them.
Yeah. And that lack of trustworthiness, or at least that perception of it, really affects how the return on investment is going to be gained from that system. So spending a large amount of money, a lot of time with people trying to develop a system, and then to have it not be accepted, not be used by the individuals it was meant for, is something, unfortunately, we see frequently, in literature as well as in our daily lives. Yeah. Any oh, go ahead, Carrie. Sorry.
I would say, actually building on that point, right? So I think a lot of folks innately appreciate on the acquisition side, when we're talking about building a potential solution, how do we do due diligence? How do we ensure it's actually meeting the operational context, fitting requirements such as security and perhaps ethics as well, and policy considerations? But it's also the product lifeline or the lifetime. How serviceable is this? How maintainable is it? When is it time to decommission or take offline a particular model? So I think we also need to be thinking about trust throughout the life cycle of both building and then maintaining these systems.
Yeah, that's a great point. The whole cost of ownership, if you will, is not small because of that continuous need for monitoring and making sure that the system's performing, as you mentioned, because it's dynamic. Yeah. Katie, you're going to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to point out that in the blog, we discussed that too. Like, it's not just, you have to consider trust and trustworthiness throughout the design and development lifecycle. And to both your points, like monitoring and maintaining after it's been deployed. And I think that's important for people to think about. It's not just one thing. You have to consider it throughout the entire time that you're working on a system and past that as well.
Yeah. And that reminds me as well, it's not just the AI model or the that particular portion, but rather how is it within the existing system? How is that particular aspect going to change the end user experience or change the interactions between some other systems? And also, if it's unavailable, if it needs to be paused because of performance, how does that affect individuals and their trustworthiness of the other systems as well? So they're really there's a lot of complexity, as we mentioned. Yeah. Awesome. All right, Shane, do we have any questions that we should jump on?
We do. And before we get to that question, I just wanted to, we got a worldwide audience here today. I see in the chat people from Spain, South America, Virginia, California. So we're spanning the globe here. So we thank for everybody chiming in on the chat there. We also added a link to the blog post that the ladies were referring to, so you can find that there. And then the question we did get was from Fordson asking, what do you think will be the primary sources of information to create that confidence? And Carol, I'm going to give that one to you to start.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I will give the standard answer that it depends. But the way that people are going to gain confidence is in relation to what they're trying to do. So if someone is using an accounting system, they're going to need to understand the sources of the numerical information they're working with. It might be business information that they need, and they may need to know, is that coming from the company? Is that coming from an external consulting company? Where is that information coming from? If they're doing vehicle maintenance of some type, they're going to need to know more about, when was particular information gathered on a system? What was the weather, perhaps? How old is the system? How old is that aspect of the system? There's a lot of different information that people need for different reasons, and so it needs to be in context and displayed in a way that is supportive and not distracting. So when I'm doing research, I often want to look at the references the paper has, but I don't necessarily want those in front of my face all the time. That's something that I look at in my way of reviewing a paper, abstract, and then I might skip around a little bit, but thinking about that workflow. What is the workflow that someone's doing? Anyone want to add to that?
I would add on, when I think about collecting information to build and assess confidence, I would break it down into perhaps 3 buckets. I think there's the organization level, the situation or the operational context, and then the end users, or really like who are the users, the humans involved in interacting with the system. So at the organization level, are there certain policies or regulations and requirements that the company or the government agency needs to be considering before deploying and actually maintaining the system? And maybe that informs even a governance process, whether again it's at the build time or continual evaluation. And then if we're thinking about operationally, is there a certain aspect of the situation, whether it's like classified sensitive data, healthcare information, or other private sensitive information that we need to kind of pay extra attention to, because this is a high stakes application of AI. And then finally, when we're thinking about the actual users involved, are these domain experts? Are they specialists? Perhaps they have more information on machine learning and data science, where they really want to get into the technical details. Or perhaps, they're more generalists, and they do need to have some type of guidance when taking the output from the system and being able to either make a decision based upon the output, or, perhaps this is just like input, right? This is kind of like next best actions. If here's like an idea to consider, but you don't have to act upon it. So just to conclude and summarize, I think, organizationally, operationally, and then the people involved, we need to be kind of taking an input to build confidence of the system for all 3.
I think to touch on both of yours as well, I thought they were both great. And when I first heard the question, the thing that immediately popped into my mind was, building confidence from other people that I know who have used the system, and that could work in either way sometimes. But I think that adds a lot of it as well. If I have a colleague who's worked on this, who gives it a glowing review, then maybe my trust and how I see the system being trustworthy is going to go up or down depending on what they tell me. And of course, me experiencing it myself and as well doing my own research. But I think, other people using the system have a really great impact on my personal opinion of a system as well.
I like that. And actually, to build on that point, right, there's the old adage, it just takes one event to break someone's trust. It just instantaneous in some regards. And it takes a long time to build that reputation. So, those AI product designers, the folks building the systems, they have to be so aware that, ultimately it's their reputation on the line. And so how the solution's being, reviewed, right? How, people are talking about it, it just takes that one bad review, and it really can kind of turn the ability to create confidence in that system.
For sure.
Yeah.
We got one more question here from Pi for this section. Maybe we can work this one in. He asks, what is a life cycle AI, as the focus and actions are much different in conception, development, verification, and deployment phases? Do you have life cycle comments?
Yeah. So CMU has the AI stack, which we've been building on for the past few years. And there are some significant differences, obviously, but the overall idea is still the same, and that we want ideally to do as iterative of work as we can. So not building things too big or too far out, if you will, ahead of getting feedback, and then learning from that feedback. So prototyping changes to some extent in that ideally we want to test out things before potentially there's actually a model to create the real data. So it's kind of faking doing Wizard of Oz type testing early on to make sure that we're building something that is of value. And then the biggest change to me, the most significant change besides the addition of data as product, as the system, that's obviously a huge change. But the other big change is we're not shipping CDs anymore. This is not static software. Mm-hmm. It does require that continuous monitoring, oversight, really extensive attention to the dynamic system in use, which has not been the case in the past. There's of course some monitoring of live software, but that software either performs or it doesn't. Versus AI systems that can drift, the data drift, the model can shift, it can start doing the wrong things, learning the wrong things, et cetera, and not be performing in the way it was intended to. Did anyone want to add on to that?
Sure. I like your comment about like as a service, right? Because I think like the software world in particular, transformed and it is mostly as a service model. AI in particular, I would say, is as a service. And there's also so many more third-party dependencies, if you will, generally, unless you're really building and curating the data and you're building the algorithms yourself from scratch. You're relying upon foundational data sets, foundational models as kind of a baseline. And so with that, just kind of taking time to introspect and evaluate the fitness, both to conform to policy, but also, does this like actually good data for the problem? Like thinking about research methods one-on-one. I think when we think about the life cycle of these systems, it's dynamic. We have to do that continuous monitoring, and we also have to think about continuous build. So if we need to roll back, we can easily roll back and mitigate.
Yeah, I think to sort of just put my own sense on that as well, I think, in previous work that I've looked at, that continuous monitoring piece is sometimes left off. And I think for a life cycle, that is like not good that it's not there. It needs to be in there, because especially with AI systems, to Carol's point, they are continuously changing. You get new data or something changes, that is going to that could potentially completely change what's being done. So I think, having those elements, actually having those iteration elements too, is highly important.
We can move on to
more questions in the queue. We can stay there, Carol. We can move on to the next section and come back.
Oh, let's take the questions. Yeah.
Okay. We got one from John here asking, do these systems exhibit emergent behavior as other complex systems will? If so, how can humans continue to trust the outcomes?
Yeah, and that is a question of, part of it is how do you define some of these terms? Does anybody want to jump on it?
You go ahead, Carol.
So my assumption is that by emergent, we're talking about a new activity, a new behavior of the system, and that is one of the benefits and risks of these systems, is that they can do things that are unexpected. But by right now, most systems are very narrow in their use and abilities. They only can do what we give them permission to do. They only can access data that is provided to them. They're not self-sufficient in any way other than how we create them. They of course can take that data and do other things with it, but part of the work, the important work that we need to do to make human-centered AI systems is really knowing what we're going to allow that system to do and being very purposeful in that design, and knowing what we will not allow it to do, and making sure that it does not have access to additional systems, that it can't combine data sets and reveal more information than we want it to, and of course that these systems are protected using cybersecurity methods, and making sure that the system is as secure and reliable as it can be. I don't know if that quite gets to the answer. Go ahead.
Okay.
You go, Carrie. Nope.
Okay, I would say so. John, I was kind of interpreting emergent behavior to perhaps be more like generative. But I think you can interpret that multiple ways. So I think on the generative AI side, one of the challenges there really is just how hard it is to evaluate. Like, what does fitness mean? How, is a model fit for use when it's generating natural language or new images? It's kind of subjective. So I think that's an inherent challenge and limitation that we have in our current state of the practice, but also opportunity, right, to explore more practices and processes there. But I think to tie back to Carol's answer, I think ultimately it's testing. It is, trying to be creative and dynamic. One thing when I was in the cybersecurity side of the house and, was learning pen testing, it was just like thinking outside the box, thinking like an adversary. And I think we need more of that when it comes to really being able to stress test, how does this model withstand like this particular condition? And we ever need that with even higher stakes applications of emergent technologies.
I think I focused on the last half of the question in terms of how do we continue to trust it? And hopefully that was the last part of the question there. But I think it sort of goes back to what we were just discussing in terms of continuous monitoring. Like even if this like emergent, depending on how you describe it, being able to go back and actually understand what's going on, and keeping an eye on what's happening and being able to check that, and be able to reference or to try again, to run different tests, to evaluate in different ways, but being able to continuously keep going back and iterating, or just keeping an eye on things, I think is really important as well.
Yeah, and acknowledging that that the system, if it's not if it's not performing as it should be, or if its capabilities are lessened for one reason or another, that the individuals who are interacting with that system are aware of that. Much easier, I think, for people to determine the system is trustworthy if it is being clear and transparent to some extent about its performance, its abilities, its providing that kind of evidence. Then people can know, yes, today this system is working well, I'm going to use it, and then tomorrow, not so much. I'm going to go back and use this other system, or I'm going to revert to a previous version that was more reliable. And giving people that kind of choice is really important.
Okay, a question from Daniel. What activity is underway to certify bias-free AI?
So this is this is always a topic of contention. We can't make a bias-free system. Humans are inherently biased. We are biased, and we make these systems, and all the data that we use to make a system is biased because it is collected for a purpose. It is organized for a reason. It is sorted and transformed, and then the model is is created, and algorithms are chosen for various reasons. All of these individual choices are made with bias. So resulting systems can never be free from bias. They can be free from harmful bias if we're careful about our work, and we can also acknowledge the bias that's in the system, so we know that the system will work. For example, if you have tomatoes in your system, are they labeled as fruit or vegetable? Are they for science, or are they for a grocery store? That's a bias. And knowing that a system was made for scientists, you wouldn't apply that to a grocery store problem, and vice versa. Those are kind of a silly example, but one that shows that even systems that you would never think of to be biased are biased because they're made for a particular end use and purpose. Anyone want to add?
Totally agree. I think, unfortunate limitation of being human. So I think acknowledging the biases and trade-offs, right? In some circumstances, a particular bias, might be more acceptable than other circumstances. Though I also think that, as we're going about establishing this discipline of AI engineering, if you will, we do need to be doing more to think about rigorous testing methods. I don't know quite yet if there's any one certification per se, but I know there's agencies out there, there's professional service firms out there that are exploring how can we do and apply stage gate processes, if you will, for development and assessment. So I think we'll be seeing more soon when it comes to certification, but as always, be careful of the single rubber stamp that this is good to go, and this really is a continuous dynamic system, and we always need to be doing that continual monitoring.
Yeah, and that's a great segue, because we do want to talk more about evaluation. Katie, were you going to jump in there? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna. I started to think, well, how do we make bias-free data? What if we got ChatGPT to make us a whole bias-free? And then I was like, no, because ChatGPT was trained on data from humans. So I mean, you could even think you've got this completely bias-free data set, and there's just to both of your points, it's not, at this moment not possible, because even if you think that there's no bias in your data, there's going to be bias somewhere in your data. You probably just haven't thought about it, or haven't thought about where it's going to show up.
Yeah, and just acknowledging that, like you said, it's not necessarily bad, and sometimes it's helpful, but we need to know what that bias is and why those choices were made. And part of that is doing that analysis of the data, and then that continuous evaluation. So really looking to see, is the system still performing the way we expect? Is the system noticing patterns in the data that weren't previously aware or known to us? Perhaps the system is actually showing us the bias because of the way it's interpreting the information, and helping us to see things that we didn't previously know. We've talked to teams that have used, in making an AI system, they have realized some of the challenges that they have in data sets. And we've also seen AI systems that there have been a number of papers that have come out where AI systems for image recognition have learned the backgrounds without the scientists necessarily being aware of it until the background changed. So for example, with dogs, I never remember the breeds, but it was like a Siberian Husky maybe and a wolf, something like that. And the one was always on grass and the other was always on snow. And then when that same animal that was on the snow was now on grass, the system did not accurately identify the animal because it was learning the background. So it was seeming to be very accurate, but actually was learning the wrong thing about it was seeing the wrong pattern.
So I think we can move on to your next topic, Carol, and then we do have some more questions. I'll get them tracked here, and we'll ask them in the next segment, so we can move on to your next topic.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think we already kind of transitioned into evaluation. I think it'd be great to talk a little bit about one of those earlier questions, was thinking about how to display information to the people who are interacting with the system. So thinking about confidence and understanding how a decision might have been made or a recommendation, and generally how that information is presented is a really important aspect, both at the early stages of design, but then as the system continues to be used, thinking about that evaluation is really important. And obviously end users need to be involved in that. Having those people who are using the system, or the system who the system is affecting, involved in those kind of activities is really important. What other, let's talk about some other evaluation methods, if you'd like, Katie.
Yeah, of course. So I think the one that's popped into my mind as you were speaking, Carol, is some explainability aspects to give people some insight into, what is going on, maybe what is the model doing, or what can the user do to interact with the system. Just providing a little bit of a layer of explanation to say, well, here's what you're should be thinking about, or here's what you need to know before using this. Just giving people a little bit more information so that they can have a bit more of that confidence, whether it's through like paragraph or like a short little statement about what's going on, or maybe it's through a confidence score or through like a hotspotter investigation, anything like that that just can give people a little bit more awareness of what's happening, what they need to know, or what could be the output of something.
Yeah, absolutely. And building on that point, right, it's very situational in the level of explanations or diagnostic information. So right now we're partnered with one engagement where we're exploring aircraft readiness. And we want to be able to forecast the mission capability of individual aircraft as well as entire fleets. And so when we're thinking about the fleet-wide aircraft availability, we don't necessarily need as detailed information just yet about a particular plane's part X to see if that really is the causal factor for the entire fleet to have like lower aircraft availability. But when we're looking at individual aircraft readiness, we do need to have the information right now to be able to do that diagnostic of, oh, it's the windshield, or it's a breaker, or it's a vibration sensor that just is out of bounds. So I think it's also, something that is very like customer dependent, application dependent about the level of detail needed to provide that confidence boost of this is what to do and why the model has that confidence and output.
Yeah, and that's a great point about this cyber physical systems and how those are easier to talk about, I think, in a lot of ways than just the interfaces on screen. So thinking about, for example, vehicles and the newer ADAS or assistance setups that we have now on consumer vehicles. Having the right information at the right time is really important. When there is an emergent situation, we don't care so much that the window washer fluid is low. Rather, we want to know, does it see what I perceive, or is the system braking appropriately, or is this lane turn the correct turn? When should I intervene? Is it already my turn? Those kinds of communications and figuring out the hierarchy and the priority of those communications to support the individual behind the wheel in that case is really important, and I think is a good model to think about other systems as well. What's important, what's urgent, what's nice and important to know, but not as urgent or a high priority.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have another question, Shane?
We sure do. Let's go to Frank. Let me get this queued up. Frank asks, what are the components or principles of AI trustworthiness that you are tracking, and how are these being defined, monitored, and evaluated?
That's a great question. Carrie, I think you had that some of those aspects listed, but it's definitely an area that we are actively researching.
Definitely. And I think, the list that we have on our blog, which I think you guys should have a link to, we do pull from the new NIST AI risk management framework and enumerating out these different components. I'll just read off just a quick list right here. So it's things like validity and reliability, safety and resiliency, accountability, transparency, explainability, privacy, and then fairness with mitigation of harmful bias. One point that comes to mind to me is when we think about validity in particular, I started off my career as a psychology undergrad student and took many research methods courses. And we explored through those the difference between internal validity, external validity, and construct validity. And I think that difference, even a little bit minute about the difference between is an instrument effective at actually establishing causality for a phenomenon and an output versus the generalizability versus, how well this particular set of indicators actually reflects the concept. That matters. And I think we need to be doing more in some regard is to kind of be able to have that fine-grained control about evaluating the overall validity of these systems. But before passing on, just one other quick note here on the fairness point. We started to talk about it earlier. I think one thing we don't talk about enough is using counterfactual examples. So for instance, we're talking about an AI model, and I saw this quite a bit in my previous work with Insider Threat, and we're studying a human problem. We also need to be making sure that we are looking at how protected class information, race, gender, age, etc., could be influencing even unintentionally the output of these models. So how can we go about exploring the difference that it could be making by including those samples and making sure that we aren't seeing discrepancies and disparate impact to those different protected classes.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because if you don't leave that information in the data set as you're building the system, you can't measure it. And so making sure that you have that information available to be able to see if the system has learned the wrong thing or to your point is becoming a system that is biased in a negative or harmful way is really important. Yeah. Katie, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think for Frank's question, I find it really interesting because I think it gets to the root of why trustworthiness is so complex at times, because everybody can define trustworthiness differently. So we've taken NIST lists and defined it out, but it could be defined different ways by different organizations. And I think that's also really interesting because that's, depending on how people define trustworthiness, and as Carrie just listed out some of the ones that we're using, you also find the trade-offs that have to happen between some of those different terms as well. So they're not all, going to agree with each other 100% of the time. So then it becomes a conversation of, well, here's how I've defined trustworthiness, but these two aspects of trustworthiness aren't going to balance out for my, case or what I'm planning to do. So having those conversations with the team and the end users and figuring out what aspects of trustworthiness need to be focused on, I think is a really interesting question. And, just seeing how people are describing trustworthiness in different ways as well.
Yeah, and that's a great point too, particularly for those of you who are joining us who are not in the United States. The cultural aspects of where and who you're designing for have to factor in as well. So what is a factor in trustworthiness in the US may not be as important in another region and in a different culture, and vice versa. There may be other things that are even more important. And so paying attention to that is really part of this work as well, is understanding, again, who you're designing for, what is it that is going to help them understand the system enough to find it to be trustworthy, and making sure that those are prioritized in the design work and throughout the life of the system.
So I think we kind of touched on this question with the bias one earlier, but I'll throw it out there in case I'm missing something. MCE asks, can AI be used to evaluate AI trustworthiness? Yeah,
for now, I would say no, because at least for now, the systems, it's certainly not independently. There may be the ability to build a system that is monitoring. Some people are actually building these systems. Certain aspects, I would say, probably can be, but not like overall bias. I would say that it's just difficult for a system that we've made to identify things that we don't know are already there. So if it's a known bias that you're watching for, then the answer is yes, I would say. If it's unknown, then it still needs human oversight. And probably even in the cases where it's there still needs to be some human oversight, particularly in higher risk situations. I always use the example of a sock recommender. If somebody gets the wrong sock, all right, not a big deal. But if it's, anything, and perhaps even in that case, you still want a human really observing and maintaining and doing that oversight piece, even if you do have an AI system monitoring something that you feel is automated in that way.
So I'm going to take perhaps a snarky response here. And Carol and Katie, I'm curious what you think. But what about our favorite topic of the week, large language models, asking ChatGPT, okay, your favorite LLM, for input, right? What are different conditions to test for bias? Perhaps that's a way, that's definitely, in my view, not complete, but as input, a way to kind of seed some different test scenarios for bias testing.
Yeah, and more interesting would be to do that, 10 different times, have 10 different people do that, and see, how that answer maybe changes too. It's still very early with a lot of these systems, but it is definitely a good way to find out more about the systems and about this particular topic.
Okay, from Terry, we have, what would be the best and most practical mechanisms for continuous monitoring?
I might jump in here and thinking about observability. So I've been utilizing model experimentation tracking tools quite a bit. An example would be MLflow. In that particular application, there's many other products like it. You can actually track in real time performance metrics of models, as well as the potential for data and how data drift might be occurring, and kind of like catch things in real time. So I would, say to this to kind of take a step back, is looking at tools that can be looking at the aggregate of all your deployed models, predefining indicators, whether it's data drift, the data level, or also the model performance level, or other indicators, and then making sure that you do have some type of dashboard view, if you will, of how performance is being handled across time, and then being able to have some type of rollback procedure. If you just catch something or the tool catches something automatically, and you'll be able to roll back to a working performant model.
Yeah. And I would say, using those tools and making sure you have a human observing, of course. Often we've seen situations where a system is being, for example, if you're using the accuracy measures, it can be very accurate, but have very low confidence. So it can be misleading sometimes to only look at the numbers, and you still need to be able to understand, like, what does this really mean in this context, or what does this really mean for those outputs, and potentially a very accurate system may miss the outliers that are actually more important, for example, to the team. So making sure that you're really answering the right question that the people using the system need to have answered.
Yeah, I think we've got one more in this section, and we'll catch us up, from David asking, how do you regression test a system when a new version of the AI tool that the system is based on becomes available? So maybe I'll throw it to Carrie, or Carrie, you can pass on it, but I'll start with you.
I'm sure. So, okay. I have to unpack a little bit. So, regression testing in general, thinking software, right? So, what changes have been made, and we want to evaluate those changes against the base software that was pre-released and vetted. I think regression testing on ML systems in general, we do really have to unpack the core dependencies, which we always think about as data and then the underlying model, particularly if it's a foundational model. I would focus in there, and then if we think about the system overall, any other feature changes or bug fixes that did occur with the release. Also want to make sure that we're kind of robustly assessing those changes against the current or previous state of the system. I don't know, Carol, Kate, if you guys have other things there to add on to that one.
Yeah, no, I think that was an excellent point. It's not just one test. I don't think you can do a regression test in the way that you would, with another system. You really do, as Carrie said, take it apart and really understand each of the pieces. Often with an off-the-shelf piece, though, you may not have access to all of it, and so it may require a lot more, as was talked about before, like pen test type testing to understand how the outputs have changed, to then determine potentially, or at least understand better what has changed within the system.
Okay, so I think we're caught up for now. So if you have any other topics or comments, you can go to Carol. Then I'll keep scanning the chat and we'll go back to it.
Okay, great. We talked a little bit, I think, about the evidence and evaluation and everything, but something we haven't talked as much about is what happens as the system changes over time, or as the individuals using the system either gain more confidence using the system or more experience using the system. So going from an inexperienced person using it to a more experienced person, and just thinking about those kinds of changes in the interface, how it might change how much evidence is shown, perhaps, and other areas that might need to adjust based on that ongoing relationship and how they're working together.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I think another layer that you could add is, you get an entirely new, different user base, but you're also still trying to support your old user base. And what does that mean? And how do you support both of those people, or both types of those people? And I think that really goes back to the fact of, like, you have to understand the people that you're designing for and looking for what they need and their needs just in general. So in terms of what information you show them, what aspects they're looking for in order to trust your system, I think become very important. But you also have to realize that you're designing for different groups of people, and that can be for a lot of different systems. So, asking those questions and really making sure that you understand what different people are looking for, the context that they're coming from, their understanding of the system, and what that means to them and what that means for you going forward.
Yeah, and to clarify, we're assuming you're still talking about a fairly narrow group of users, not
yes,
but yeah, within that group, there are definitely different needs. Yeah,
yeah. I also took the question from the perspective of an organization. So ultimately, these are investments, and the point is not necessarily to adopt AI as the latest emerging technology promise, but to make more efficient or effective, business process or mission process. So I would also just add on that as we're thinking about human and AI integration, we're also looking at, how is this being performant and useful to the enterprise? And so if, for instance, I'm thinking back to my time in CERT, and I was working on a workflow automation tool for pen testing. And we needed to have agility when conducting pen tests. And so there was times that arose when it didn't make sense to use the prototype that we were building, mostly because it was like a particular environment. We wanted to test a particular circumstance or scenario. And so, just kind of like making sure the humans are in control for most applications, and being able to pivot and, be agile as necessary. So I think that human AI integration piece is something we always have to be thinking back to. Why are we actually using this technology? Well, it's probably for some organizational purpose. And, it's not really the technology we need, it's the process and the output from that.
Excellent. Sean, did we have more questions?
So we do. We got a question from Pi asking, and there's some acronyms in here with I'm not familiar with. I'm hoping you guys are, but he asks, one could be an expert in GNN, but be unskilled in LSTM methods. So thoughts on trustworthy in defining an expert in trustworthiness?
Yeah, that I'm thinking there's neural networks in that first one, but yeah, the other acronym I've not heard. Either of you?
I think LSTM, long-term, short-term memory neural networks.
Oh, yes. Okay, thank you. Yes.
GNN, Gaussian neural networks. I don't know if that's quite what you mean by GNN. Apologies on that. But to me, right, there's different technical, techniques and tools. Lime, Shapely values, for instance, those are plugins specifically targeting neural networks. So I think you think about the tooling, but really, it's the type of model or really algorithm at that level. And then what's the fit tool and process for exploring and auditing explainability aspects of the model?
All right,
Katie,
David,
though, if I may, so Katie, you did a lot of research in explainability and tools. So I don't know if there's anything there from your research, kind of looking at, a spectrum of different, open source tools and explainable AI that you think might be informative, just kind of like a general takeaway there.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Carrie. Yeah, so in some of the work that I did, it was looking at different, responsible AI tools and coming from different sources, and what can you use, what maybe is better than others. And of course, I'm not going to recommend one over the other, but it was nice to be able to investigate what each tool presented and what they thought each person was looking for in terms of, the information that they thought people would need, and how they were approaching those different things and gaining people's trust and using these different tools. So I thought that was really interesting. So in terms of, what tools are going to give more trustworthiness or trust, I think it really depended. It was how people approached the tools and how they presented them, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and that's a great great point to bring up, because the tool's purpose itself, is obviously going to be part of matching that up with the context, but also when you're evaluating it, really thinking about how is this going to give me the right information? Is it going to really be even usable? And in some cases, some of the tools that you tested, if I remember correctly, they were just hard to even use themselves. And then there's the privacy and IP aspect, intellectual property aspect, where in some cases you may have to give up quite a bit of your organization's information in order to know if that's a good tool. So it's something to be aware of, particularly with all of these tools that are coming out. Anytime you type something into them, or upload something, you're giving them potentially access to all of that information moving forward, and just being aware of that aspect of testing out technologies as well.
Yeah, that's a great point, Carol. I remember for some of the tools that we looked at, it was upload your data set here, and you could dig a little bit deeper, and it was like, well, you're keeping my data set once I give it to you, and maybe that's not something that I should be sharing with you. So really, it took a bit of time to find that information, whereas some, they bold-faced told you, we're keeping it, we're not keeping it, here's what we're doing. And that changed the way I approach different tools as well, and talked about different tools to all of our different people as well. So I think that goes back to some of the earlier points that we were talking about. Some of that trust and trustworthiness is coming from the people that I know who've interacted with these systems.
Okay, so we can go to a question from David here. And then I was going to go back to you guys for some closing thoughts, or you maybe talk about some of the work that the SEI is doing in this area. Maybe you guys can touch on that, and then we can wrap it up with another question or two. We got about 12 minutes left. So David wanted to know, are we looking at AI systems that evolve by train then test, or are there other AI forms that would need different trustworthiness standards?
Yeah,
Carol,
I mean,
I'm looking at you.
Yeah. So most, if not the majority anyway, of systems we're working with are in the machine learning world. So even the deep learning, neural network. A lot of this, there's some basis. Data is prepared, in at least to some extent, and then the system is using a algorithm to find a pattern in it. And so those systems, we would apply, I think these methods work for all of those. For newer, as new systems are developed, we're going to probably have to come up with new ways of looking at them. And even then, we're still developing, ways to evaluate the current system. So this is it's an ongoing process, and certainly there is plenty more work to do. Carrie or Katie, did you have more to add?
I would maybe just add, expert systems are still out there and they're definitely not as prominent. But there's also actually really kind of, thinking about as a software engineer, you can mix methods here, right? So you can have a ML-based recommender system feed in input to an expert, logic control software system. So I think just kind of like decomposing the software stack and thinking about what is the right test methodology for a particular set of logic, whether it is, data-driven ML, or it is a knowledge-based, well-defined, discrete solution. So just being creative and making sure that the test method matches the type of AI that you're using.
Yeah.
I think just to add on to that as well, going back to those elements of trustworthiness that we discussed, it's, what are you hoping your system is going to achieve, and what elements are you really looking at? And using, developing test metrics or evaluation metrics based on those different aspects that you're hoping to match up with.
Okay, maybe we can go some closing thoughts, Carol, or maybe work that each of you are doing in this area, and then we can wrap up with another audience or question or two. So maybe Carol, back to you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think you mentioned some of the work that we're doing.
Yeah.
I can touch briefly on 3 of the projects that we mentioned also in the blog. So we're looking particularly at fairness and how to identify and mitigate the bias in a machine learning model, and looking at how that not only contributes to trustworthiness, but also how, particularly with regard to hiring pipelines, where equitable treatment is really a priority and a legal requirement, how AI systems can potentially support that work. We're also looking at robustness. Oh, and the fairness work is being led by Anisha Sinha here at the SEI and the AI division. Another project is on robustness. Eric Heim is leading that work, and really looking at the fact that these systems will fail. AI systems will fail. All systems fail at some point. But what is the likelihood of failure, and how do we quantify that so that end users have that information and understand the context, the situation, the likelihood of that situation, and are able to use that information again to determine how trustworthy the system is in the current context or moving forward. And finally, a third effort that Violet Torrey is leading is on explainability. So really, again, looking at, and that's the one that Katie is also supporting that one, understanding the different stakeholders' needs with regard to explainability, so that they do understand the system, for looking at primarily the decision makers who are involved in the acquisition of these systems. Katie, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. So to touch on that a little bit more, we're trying to build out process frameworks for AI engineers to support what elements of explainability are needed throughout the AI lifecycle, and what that means to AI engineers, what they need to see, and holding different opportunities to talk to these people to understand the systems that they're using, what's missing, and what can be our add-in that they would need for explainability purposes going forward, and then hopefully sharing that framework that we develop with other people so that explainability can be more integrated throughout the lifecycle.
Carrie, do you want to talk a little bit about the work here?
Sure, and I love that point, Katie, about like the process, because that's actually what I was going to get at. So in the AI for Mission portfolio, we're doing a lot of prototyping and exploring the state of the possible with AI, and then trying to translate that into tangible artifacts that can inform our work sponsors. And one of the things I found to be most valuable through having these conversations and engagements is it's not just prototyping a functional model or a functional solution. It's also, working with these sponsors to understand, here's the process for how we're going about that development of the prototype. Here's how we're performing test and evaluation. And here's a platform to, maybe automate portions of that process and think about just even tracking metrics for, continuous monitoring. And there's also a little bit of the workforce development piece, making sure, the folks that are utilizing the system are comfortable with interpreting the output, are comfortable with doing the test and evaluation, and making sure they're, able to audit the system overall. So just to take a step back, it's both, yes, prototype development, but it's also process, platform, and then workforce development.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, and in addition, we're doing a variety of different prototyping efforts, looking at impact and assessments, harms analysis, and what kinds of tools might be helpful there, looking at what it takes to help engineering teams to really manage the work, and making tools to help with that, working on more workforce development, developing curriculums to help people to really engage with these systems and begin to be able to make these systems. A lot of different efforts underway within the AI division, and within the AI engineering center, and really looking at the human-centered aspects of them.
Great, thank you guys for that information. We got the 5-minute warning, so I think we can get in 2 more audience questions here. So Pi had asked, if greater than 60% of communications is nonverbal, how can people ever trust AI, since the nonverbal aspect is missing the effort to communicate?
So I'm assuming that because it's all in text, because it's not.
Yeah.
I don't know how to answer that one, actually. That's a anyone want to jump in?
That's actually, it's making me think. I just finished reading the Trusted Advisor book, and I'm forgetting the authors, but it talks about a formula of trust. And they decompose trust as credibility plus reliability plus intimacy over self-orientation. And this is talking about trust between a consulting firm, a particular partner, let's say, and a client. And that's a very human relationship. And so I'm just kind of, thinking through this, credibility, reliability, we've kind of talked about those being a little bit more technical metrics, we can establish measures for. I think intimacy and self-orientation, to me, there's a little bit more human oriented. And I think that is a bit more qualitative. It's kind of like, really experiencing the impression that people leave with you, their reputation that's been established. And I do think that, actually tying it back to Katie's point earlier in the conversation on reputation, we need to be thinking about, what's the effect these systems are leaving people with? And, are they able to be personalized to some degree for a particular application? But ultimately, when we're thinking about trust, I think it is very, very hard to establish the level of, perhaps, the qualitative, nonverbals that we have with each other, human to human. And so, yes, I think we need to be thinking about what decision aids or tool aids we should be implementing and prototyping, so we can provide that assurance to our inanimate AI decision support tools.
Yeah, I think to add on to that as well, and we talk about it in the blog, and there's all these elements of trustworthiness, and you could read every one of them, and people could still not trust your system, just because that's their position, that's the context that they come with, the familiarity that they have with the system. So I think that goes to the point that we've brought up quite a few times, is knowing the people that you're designing for and understanding what they're looking for, to be able to address those different elements, and to hopefully gain their trust through the different aspects that you've taken on throughout the entire life cycle.
Yeah, and I think I got stuck because most of my computing interactions are without any sort of verbal interaction. So typing into screens and that sort of thing. So I think there's some systems I trust and some I don't. And some systems I would describe as trustworthy and some I would not. And the closeness to them being more like a human doesn't factor in at all, I would say, because I'm not comparing that relationship to one I have with a human. I'm comparing it to other computing systems or other resources I have. Should I use a book? Should I use my paper thesaurus next to me, or should I Google it, or use another online tool to find the word I'm looking for? It's more just which tool then is trustworthy for this particular task, or easier, honestly, than it is more of a that kind of judgment, I think. So to me, I think that was where I was getting stuck. So it was great to hear those other answers. Yeah.
All right, we got about a minute left, so if we can make this somewhat quick if possible, just from Terry asking, if we measure to evaluate performance and trustworthiness, do you think this data should be made available to users on demand in real time? Should there be standards on what should be shared?
No, I'll say it depends again. A more technical audience is going to perhaps be comfortable seeing numbers. Most humans are horrible about interpreting percentages, for example, so it's really not going to help most people really understand a system if it's just a generated number. Other people are going to not want to know that at all, and some people are going to need a lot of information. It's really going to be dependent on the situation and what context they're in, and yeah, but there's no easy answers. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Carol, Katie, Carrie, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Great conversation today.
Yeah, thank you for all the questions. This has been great.
Yeah, and we'd like to thank you all for attending as well. Upon exiting, please hit the like button below and share the archive if you found value. Also, you can subscribe to the SEI's YouTube channel by clicking on the SEI seal in the lower right corner of the video window. Our next webcast will be September 26th, and the topic will be an Ask Us Anything, the Generative AI edition. Registration information is available on our website now and will be emailed out as well. Any question from today's event, please send to info@sei.cmu.edu. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.